The year was 1868, and the war had left Texas with more ghosts than buried men. The sky over the high plateau was a sheet of hot, faded blue, baked hard as pottery. Dust, red and fine as cinnamon, settled on everything. It coated the brittle leaves of the mesquite trees and filmed the slow, brown water of the Pecos River. Beside the river, sprawling in the heat, lay the McCade Ranch, its fences in need of mending, its cattle lean from a dry season. A few miles on, the town of Mesquite Ford huddled against the grit. It was a place of unpainted wood, false fronts, and a wide, rutted street that served as a highway for dust devils. Law here was a loose garment, worn thin by convenience and stretched wide by Sheriff Dalton. On the edges of this loose law, in barns and livery stables far from the main street, events took place that belonged to an older, harder time. They called them debt auctions. They were markets for human desperation, sanctioned not by a judge, but by the heavy hand of the men who ran the county. Inside a stifling hay barn, the air thick with the smell of dry rot and old manure, Lena Cartwright stood waiting. She was 25 years old, but her eyes held the flat, patient vigilance of someone much older. She had survived the raid that had burned her home and taken her family 8 years prior. That survival had taught her silence. She kept her gaze low, fixed on the splintered floorboards, her hands bound not with iron, but with a rough rope that chafed her skin. Her silence was a fortress. Inside it, she was sharp, alert, cataloging every sound, the jingle of a spur, the low, greasy laugh of a deputy, the scrape of a boot. On her left wrist, hidden beneath the rope and the cuff of her worn sleeve, was a scar. It was old, pale against her skin, and shaped like a perfect, thin crescent moon. It was an atlas of a night she never spoke of, tucked deep in the pocket of her skirt. Her fingers could just brush the cold metal of the one thing she had saved, a heavy silver watch, its case smooth. The back was engraved with a curling, elegant R. Robert Cartwright. It was her father's. It was the last solid piece of the world that had burned. Outside, under the punishing sun, Grant McCade sat his horse. He was 56, a man carved from old wood, his face a map of sun and worry. He was a rancher, and the McCade land had been his family's for 2 generations, but the name felt like a stone in his gut. He carried a guilt that did not belong to him alone, but had been passed down like the deed to the ranch, a debt of blood and fire that his father had incurred and left for him to pay. He looked toward the barn, his jaw tight. He hated these auctions. They were a sickness, a rot that had set in after the war, feeding on the weak and the displaced. His gaze shifted to the man standing by the barn door. Sheriff Dalton. Dalton was a big man, his bulk filling out the black vest and the silver star. He ruled Mesquite Ford with a simple currency, violence and fear. He ran the auctions. He manipulated the debt lists. Men who owed nothing found their names on his papers. Men with good land found themselves suddenly bankrupt, their property seized and sold for pennies on the dollar to Dalton's associates. The war had been a harvest for men like Dalton, and the reconstruction that followed was just a second planting. Whispers in the saloons and the general store spoke of a black ledger, a book where Dalton kept the true account of his stolen empire. Families had been broken, scattered to the wind by debts that were nothing but ink and lies. Grant knew the stories. He knew the families. He knew, with a certainty that soured his stomach, that the fire which had consumed the Cartwright place had been fuel for Dalton's rise. And he knew his own family's part in that original sin. He had not come here to bid. He had come to watch, a penance, to witness the stain that he could not wash from his own name. High above the town, hidden in the broken rocks of the plateau, a third man watched. His name was Taza. He was Mescalero Apache, a warrior of about 30 years, his body lean and hard as the land itself. He moved with a quiet economy, his presence blending into the heat and the stone. He was a free man, and his calmness came from that freedom, a stillness of the soul that the white men below him did not possess. He was not watching the auction. He was tracking. A string of his people's best horses had been stolen, driven off in the night. His hunt had led him here, to the outskirts of Mesquite Ford. He had watched for 2 days. He saw the men who had taken the horses. He saw them laugh with Sheriff Dalton's deputies. He saw them trade coins and whiskey at the back door of the saloon. The sheriff, the man who wore the star, was the root of the theft. The auction, the town, the stolen land, the stolen horses. It was all the same sickness, the same greed. Taza was patient. He would wait. He would learn the shape of this corruption before he cut it. The sun reached its zenith, a white-hot coin in the sky. The dry wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the barn, carrying the sound of nervous coughs and the clink of iron. The auction was beginning. The sound was a signal, a pulling of a string that drew the three of them tighter into the same small, dusty space. Lena heard the main door groan open. Light flooded in, blinding her for a moment. She felt the rope on her arm pulled, and she stumbled forward, catching her balance with the dignity she clung to. She did not raise her eyes, but she felt the gaze of the men, the calculation, the indifference. She was a piece of property, a stray to be claimed. Grant shifted in his saddle. He saw them bring her out, a young woman, dusty and bound, her head bowed. He saw the stillness in her, the refusal to break, and he felt the old guilt rise in his throat, hot and choking. He saw the ghosts of the Cartwrights, of Robert and his wife, standing in the smoke of their burning home. He had been there that night, too late, too afraid. He had done nothing. Dalton stepped forward, a piece of paper in his hand. He smiled, a thin, cold expression. He spoke of debts to the county, of vagrancy, of the need to maintain order. His voice was smooth, but beneath it was the sound of a hammer cocking. Taza watched from the rocks. He saw the woman. He saw the sheriff. He saw the circle of predators. He also saw the road that led away from the town, forking east, the road to El Diablo Canyon. That is where the tracks of the stolen horses went. It was a place of jagged rock and bad memory, a place where secrets from the war had been taken and buried deep in the stone. It was a place, he knew, that men like Dalton would find useful. The air in Mesquite Ford grew heavy, thick with things unsaid, with debts unpaid and crimes unanswered. The slow, atmospheric dread of the long afternoon began to tighten. The wind blew, carrying the sound of Dalton's voice beginning the bidding, and the faint, distant sound of hooves moving toward the canyon. The stage was set. The players were in place. The first move was about to be made. The auctioneer, a thin man in a dirty shirt, did not use a hammer. He used his voice, a nasal whine that cut through the heat. He was selling debt, selling labor, a ranch hand who owed the saloon, a farrier who had lost his tools, and then Lena. The deputy shoved her forward into the patch of dusty sunlight. She did not stumble. Sheriff Dalton stood by the door, his arms crossed. He watched the crowd. The auctioneer licked his lips. He said, "Here we have a woman, name unknown, vagrant, owed the county for feed in a cell, good for mending, cleaning, field work if needed." He looked at the paper in his hand. "The debt is $5. Do I hear $5 for her labor?" The barn was silent, save for the buzz of flies. The men looked. They were ranchers, drifters, storekeeps. They saw a woman, 25 years old, thin but strong, her face blank. They saw trouble. They saw someone Dalton had an interest in. A man in the back laughed. "I will give you $2, he said, "if she can cook." Another man said, "3, and she mows the hay." This was the way of it, a human life measured in cents, bartered like a sack of feed. Lena kept her eyes on the floor. She could feel the gaze of Sheriff Dalton, a heavy, possessive weight. He was enjoying this. The degradation was the point. The auctioneer said, "I have $3. Do I hear 4? The main door, which had been left open to the blinding street, was suddenly filled by a shadow. A man stepped in, blocking the light. The bidding stopped. Grant McCade walked into the barn. He did not look at the auctioneer. He did not look at Dalton. His boots were old, scarred, and heavy on the wooden planks. He walked past the small crowd, his face set like hard, dry earth. He stopped in front of Lena. The auctioneer, flustered, said, "Mr. McCade, we are at $3 for this one." Grant reached into his pocket. He did not pull out silver. He pulled out a single coin, heavy and gold. He tossed it. It spun in the air, a small sun, and landed on the auctioneer's table with a solid, definitive sound. A $20 gold piece. The barn went absolutely silent. Men breathed in. $20. It was not a bid. It was a purchase. It was a statement that ended all other discussion. It was enough to buy a good horse, a herd of young cattle. It was an absurd, shocking amount for a debt of $5. Dalton uncrossed his arms. His smile faded. Grant looked at the deputy who stood near Lena, holding the key to the iron cuffs on her wrists. "Give it to me," Grant said. The deputy looked at Dalton. The sheriff's eyes were flat, cold as stone. He gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. The deputy, his hand shaking slightly, fumbled the key from his belt and handed it to Grant. Grant stepped toward Lena. She flinched, a small, bird-like movement, the first she had made. He stopped. He held up the key. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. He moved slowly. He took her left wrist. The iron was hot from the air. He fumbled with the lock. His hands were large, calloused, clumsy with the small key. Lena watched his face. He was sweating. He was not looking at her, but at the lock, his jaw tight. The lock clicked open. He pulled the heavy cuff from her wrist. He did the same for the right. He stepped back, holding the open irons in one hand. He looked at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them, finally landing on Sheriff Dalton. He spoke, his voice rough, not loud, but it filled the small space. "No one," he said, "deserves to wear these things. Not in a free country." He let the cuffs drop. They hit the dusty floor with a heavy, metallic clang. The sound echoed. It was the sound of a chain breaking, the sound of a door slamming shut. Lena did not move. She stood, her hands free, and rubbed her wrists. She raised her head. For the first time, she looked directly at Grant McCade. Her eyes were not soft. They were not grateful. They were the color of slate, hard and assessing. She saw a man older than her father, a man with guilt in his eyes, a man who had just spent a fortune for a reason she could not yet see. He had bought her, just as the man who wanted a cook had tried to. The price was different. The act was the same. She spoke. Her voice was not a whisper. It was clear and low, filed to a sharp point, meant for him alone. "You paid for me," she said. He met her gaze. He saw the fire deep behind the coldness. "Now do it," she said. It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a command, a challenge. He had paid the price. Now he must do the work. Do what? The words hung in the air between them. Protect, tell the truth, take responsibility. He had bought the whole weight of her past, and she was handing it to him. The crowd stirred. Men shuffled their feet. This was not the entertainment they had come for. This was something else, something dangerous. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward, his boot heels loud. He smiled again, a thin, cold expression that did not touch his eyes. "Freedom," he said, his voice conversational, "has its price. McCade, you just paid yours." In the deep shadows at the back of the barn, near a stack of empty barrels, Taza watched. He had slipped in unseen, his moccasins making no sound. He was just another shadow in a barn full of them. He had seen the entire exchange. He had seen the gold coin. He had seen the iron cuffs fall. He was not watching Grant or Lena. He was watching the men around Sheriff Dalton. He saw the deputy. He saw two other men, men who did not look like ranchers. They wore their pistols low. One had a long, puckered scar on his cheek. The other wore a hat with a band of rattlesnake skin. Taza's body went still. He knew them. He had seen them 2 nights ago, in the moonlight, driving the horses hard toward the east. They were the thieves, and they stood with the sheriff. They were his men. The man with the star was the man who had stolen from his people. Dalton took another step toward Lena. Grant moved without thinking. He did not draw his weapon. He simply stepped sideways, placing his body between Lena and the sheriff. It was a simple, protective gesture, an animal shielding its own. The air in the barn became thick, electric. A man in the back quietly moved toward the door. Dalton stopped. He looked at Grant, at the way the older rancher stood, solid as an oak post. The sheriff's smile widened, but it was a snarl. He reached slowly into his vest pocket. He did not pull out his gun. He pulled out a single, heavy brass cartridge, a .45 caliber bullet. He held it up for Grant to see. Then, slowly, he reached out and placed it, standing upright, on the rough wooden post of the auction block, a brass monument to an unspoken threat. "The past is not buried." "McCade," Dalton said, his voice soft, "not all of it." Grant's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what the bullet meant. It meant fire. It meant smoke. It meant the Cartwright Ranch. 8 years gone. His gaze flickered from the bullet to the woman standing just behind his shoulder. She was rubbing her left wrist, her head down again, as if staring at the place where the iron had been. Grant looked at her wrist. He saw it, pale against her sun-darkened skin. Revealed now that the cuff was gone, was a scar. It was old, silvery, and shaped like a perfect, thin crescent moon. The barn, the heat, the danger, it all fell away. Grant was 8 years in the past. He was riding hard, choking on smoke, drawn by the orange glow that had eaten the sky. He had arrived too late. The house was a skeleton of fire. The barn was collapsing. He had heard a sound, not a scream, a small, animal whimper. By the creek, huddled in the mud, was a child, a girl, maybe 16, maybe 17. Her arm was bleeding, a deep, curved gash from a piece of tin roofing that had flown like a blade in the explosion. He had been paralyzed by shame, by his father's sin, by his own cowardice. He had known this fire was no accident. He had known who had set it. He had dismounted, his hands shaking. The girl had looked at him with eyes that were already dead. He had ripped the neckerchief from his own neck. He had bound the wound, a deep crescent cut. He had tied it tight, his fingers clumsy. "Run," he had told her. "Follow the water. Do not stop. Do not look back." He had gotten on his horse and ridden away, leaving her there. He had told himself she was dead. He had hoped she was dead. It was easier than imagining what might have happened to her. He looked at the woman in front of him, the woman he had just bought. He looked from the scar to her face. The child's face was gone, replaced by the hard planes of a woman who had survived. But the eyes, they were the same. It was her. It was Lena Cartwright. The ghost, the sin, the past, standing right in front of him. Dalton saw the recognition in Grant's face. The sheriff's smile was triumphant. He knew, he had known all along who she was. This was not an auction. It was a message. Grant's voice was a rasp. He said, "We are leaving." He did not wait for an answer. He put his hand on Lena's elbow. She was rigid, but she did not pull away. He turned his back on Sheriff Dalton, on the bullet, on the crowd. It was the most dangerous move he had made in 8 years. He and Lena walked, They walked out of the hot, rank darkness of the barn. They walked into the blinding, dusty white light of the street. The crowd parted for them, silent, their faces a blur. Dalton did not stop them. He just watched them go, his hand resting near the bullet on the post. Taza saw them leave. He saw the two horse thieves mount their ponies. They did not look at Grant or Lena. They spurred their horses east, toward the low, broken hills, toward the canyon. Taza melted back into the shadows. He slipped out the back wall of the barn, a space where a board had rotted through. His pony was waiting in a dry arroyo, patient as stone. He mounted in one smooth motion. He did not follow Grant and Lena. He followed the thieves. The trail was fresh, and it led to El Diablo Canyon. Grant led the way. His shoulders slumped, the $20 gold piece having bought him a ghost. He had procured a quiet bay mare from the livery for Lena, the change from his coin covering the cost with ease. She rode a few yards behind him, a deliberate, calculated distance. The red dust, stirred by his horse, settled on her. She did not wipe it away. She watched his back. She saw the way his spine was rigid. A man braced for a blow. The trail to the McCade ranch was a narrow scar through the chaparral. The sun was hot, the silence between them heavier than the heat. There was only the rhythmic plodding of 4 hooves, the squeak of old leather, the sigh of the dry wind. He had to speak. The silence was a judgment. He reined his horse to a walk, letting her come up almost beside him. He did not look at her. He stared at the space between his horse's ears. "I was there," he said. Lena's hands tightened on the reins. Her horse, sensing the tension, tossed its head. "That night," he continued, his voice a dry rasp. "The fire. I saw it from my land. I rode over." He stopped. The cowardice of the memory choked him. He had not ridden over to help. He had ridden over to see what his father's greed had finally done. "I was too late," he said. "The house. It was already gone. I found you, by the creek." Lena said nothing. She looked straight ahead, her face a mask of pale dust. "Your arm," he said. "It was cut. From the tin, I think." He finally looked at her. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if he were not there at all. "I tied it with my neckerchief," he said. "I told you to run." He waited for an answer, a word, an accusation. He received nothing but the sound of the wind. He had confessed a small, splintered piece of the truth. He had confessed to being a witness, a bystander. He had not confessed to the rest. He had not confessed that the fire was no accident. He had not confessed that his own father, old Angus McCade, had been partners with Dalton, that they had wanted the Cartwright water rights, that the fire had been the final, bloody signature on a stolen deed. He had not confessed that his inheritance, the very land he was riding to, was stained with her family's blood. Lena urged her horse a few feet forward, pulling ahead of him slightly. She did not want him at her side. She wanted him in her sight. Her right hand, free from the reins, slipped into the pocket of her skirt. Her fingers found the heavy, smooth silver of the watch. She wrapped her hand around it, the metal cool against her palm. It was the only solid thing in a world that had become smoke and lies. He had been there. He had seen it. He had bound her arm, and he had ridden away, leaving a 17-year-old girl to face the night alone. And now, 8 years later, he had bought her. The anger she felt was a cold, clean thing. It was not hot. Hot anger burned out. This was a blue ice, sharp and hard. But beneath the ice was the cold, practical voice of survival. She had no money. She had no home. She had no name but the one he had recognized. She was a vagrant, just as the auctioneer had said. This man, this Grant McCade, was her only anchor, and an anchor could save you, or it could drown you. She had to find out which. They rode on, the shadows of the mesquite trees stretching long and thin across the trail as the afternoon began to fade. Grant led them off the main trail into a small grove, a place where a massive, ancient oak tree spread its branches wide. A shallow spring pooled at its base, greening the earth in a small circle. "We will rest the horses," he said, dismounting. He moved stiffly, his age showing in his knees. Lena slid from the mare, her movements fluid. She did not wait for him. She went to the spring, knelt and cupped water in her hands, drinking deeply. She washed the dust from her face, her hands. She felt him watching her. She rose and walked to the far side of the massive trunk. She sat, her back against the bark, facing the trail they had just left. She was a sentry. She was a prisoner. She was both. Grant watched her. He saw the rejection. He saw the strength. The cowardice he felt was a physical sickness, a souring in his stomach. He had told the truth, but it was a liar's truth, a piece given to hide the whole. He busied himself with the horses, loosening their cinches, letting them drink. The distance between him and the woman was 20 yards of silent accusation. The sun touched the horizon, bleeding orange and purple into the blue. The air grew still. A man stepped out from a cluster of boulders 50 feet away. He did not ride up. He did not make a sound. One moment, the clearing held only the two of them. The next, he was there, standing as if he had grown from the dry earth. Lena was on her feet in an instant, the silver watch disappearing back into her pocket. Grant's hand dropped to the pistol on his hip. The man raised one hand, palm open. He was Apache. He was tall, lean, his black hair bound by a simple strip of cloth. He carried a bow, not a rifle. His gaze was calm, steady, and missed nothing. It was Taza. He looked at Grant's hand, still on his pistol. "Your hand is fast," he said, "but the man watching you is faster." Grant froze. What man? Taza nodded back down the trail. "One rider. He has been following you since you left the town. He stopped when you stopped. He waits in the rocks, a mile back. He waits for dark." Grant's blood chilled. "Dalton..." Taza looked from Grant to Lena, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. He saw the mark on her wrist where the iron had been. He saw her stillness. "I am tracking," Taza said. "Stolen horses. My trail crosses yours." He looked at the sky, now deepening to indigo. "It is better to meet the dark with 3 sets of eyes than with 2. Grant looked at Lena. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She understood the math of the frontier. An enemy's enemy was, for tonight, a shield. "We will camp here," Grant said. They built a small fire, not for warmth, but for coffee. They built it deep in a hollow of rocks, a fire that would not cast a wide light. Taza shared his jerky. Grant offered his coffee. Lena sat slightly apart, watching, listening. Grant asked Taza about the stolen horses. "They were taken 2 nights ago," Taza said, his voice quiet, blending with the new sound of crickets. "Good horses, fast. The tracks were easy to follow." He looked into the small flames. They led to a man with a rattlesnake hatband, and that man led to the town. "Today, in the barn. I saw him. He stands with the man who wears the star." Grant felt a grim, cold certainty settle on him. "So it is one web," he said. Taza nodded. "Your people," he said, his gaze on Grant. "You talk of freedom. You build fences and you say, 'This is my freedom.' You write on paper and say, 'This is my freedom.' But freedom is not a fence. Freedom is not a piece of paper." He gestured to the wide, dark prairie around them. "This is freedom. But it is not free. It is held by the community. It is held by the warriors who watch the borders. It is held by the women who guard the children. Freedom is a duty." He looked at Lena. "The man with the star," Taza said. "He breaks the community. He uses the law to steal the horses, the land. It is the same." Lena's head snapped up. "The land." Grant looked at her, then at Taza. He is right. The auctions, they are not about debt. He felt the rest of the confession pushing at his throat. Dalton and men like him, men like my father, they created false debts. They filed papers on ranchers who were struggling, on homesteaders. They drove them out. The auctions are a show. They are a way to make the theft look like law. Lena's breath caught. Her family had been homesteaders. They had been struggling. The fire. It was not a raid. It was an eviction. It was a murder for a piece of paper. Her hand went to her pocket, her knuckles white as she gripped the watch. So a new tense agreement settled over the small fire. An alliance of necessity. I am staying at your ranch, Lena said to Grant. Her voice was flat. It was not a request for shelter. It was a statement of fact. I will work, but I am not your servant. I am not what you bought. Grant nodded. His face shadowed. I know, he said, I know. You will be a guest. Taza watched them. He saw the shape of their broken history. My trail leads east, he said, to El Diablo Canyon. The horse tracks go there. I will find their camp. I will see how many they are. Then I will return. He stood, melting into the darkness to check the perimeter, his moccasins making no sound on the stone. Grant and Lena were left alone by the fire, the silence returning, now filled with new, sharper knowledge. Grant looked at the fire. He saw the burning timbers of the Cartwright house. He saw his father's face, hard and satisfied. He picked up a piece of burned wood from the edge of the flames. It crumbled in his hand, leaving a black smear of ash on his palm. He stared at it. This was his inheritance. Ash. He wiped his hand on his trousers, but the stain remained. He looked at Lena. She was watching him, her eyes unblinking in the firelight. He saw her gaze drop to his hand, to the black smear. He said nothing. He offered her no comfort. He did not move closer. He respected the line she had drawn, the space of her anger. It was the first honest thing he had done for her in 8 years. Taza returned. He stepped back into the small circle of light. His face was calm. He held something in his open palm. He dropped it onto the dirt between Grant and Lena. It was a small brass shell casing. It was still warm. From our watcher, Taza said he fired it, to let his friends know where he is. Grant picked it up. It was heavy. He turned it over. On the flat primer at the base, a letter had been crudely scratched with a knife point. A D. Dalton. The scout was not just a scout. He was a messenger. The bullet Dalton had placed on the auction post had found them. Lena looked at the casing. She looked at Grant's face, pale in the dim light. A sound cut the night. A single sharp scrape of a steel horseshoe on rock, far out in the darkness. Instantly, Taza moved. He was not there. He was a shadow at the edge of the rocks, his bow in his hand. An arrow was knocked, the gray feather brushing his cheek. He did not make a sound, but the intent of the weapon was as loud as a shout. There was another sound from the darkness, a muffled curse, the sound of a horse being pulled back, turned quickly, the sound of hooves retreating, moving fast, fading into the night. The scout had seen him. He had seen the bow. He had seen the third man. Silence fell again, heavier this time. Taza lowered his bow. He stepped back to the fire. He is gone, he said. He will go back to the town. He will tell the sheriff that the girl is not alone. Grant, Lena, and Taza looked at each other over the dying embers. The night was vast, and the town of Mesquite Ford was no longer a place of strangers. It was the den of a man who had just declared war. They rode into the McCade ranch just after dawn. The night had been sleepless, the three of them taking turns on watch. The scout had not returned. The ranch was large, but it was weary. It sagged under the weight of Grant's guilt. The main house was solid, built of river stone and thick timber. But the fences on the south pasture were down. The wire coiled like dead snakes in the dust. The horse barn was missing shingles, and the grain store looked worryingly low for the start of a long, dry summer. Taza watered his pony at the trough, his eyes scanning the property, noting its vulnerabilities. Its lack of defenders. He said to Grant, "You have land, but you do not hold it. A fence is only a line until it is protected." He nodded to the broken sections. "Dalton knows this." Grant flinched, the words striking true. He had let the ranch slide, just as he had let his father's sin fester. Lena dismounted, her body aching, but her mind clear. She did not wait for Grant to host her. She was not a guest. She was a survivor, and this was a defensible position. She walked to the grain store, her steps precise. She unlatched the door. The smell of meal and dust and mice met her. She looked at the sacks. She began to count, calculating portions, figuring how long it would last with 3 more mouths, and what they would need from the town. She moved to the chicken coop, her movements economical, checking for eggs. She found 3. She went to the well, her hands checking the rope, her eyes judging the water level. She was assessing the fortress. She had been bought, but she would not be a burden. She would be a necessity. Grant watched her. He saw the girl from the creek, the one who had survived. Now a woman who knew how to manage, how to endure. He felt a profound, burning shame. He had done nothing but hide for 8 years. She had done nothing but fight. He turned and walked to the small workshop behind the house. He found 2 long, straight boards of pine wood and his father's old tools. He worked for an hour, the sound of his saw and hammer carrying in the still morning air. He was not a good carpenter. The cuts were rough, but he worked with a focused intensity. He finished. He carried the 2 simple, heavy wooden crosses to a small rise behind the house, a place that overlooked the brown ribbon of the Pecos. He dug into the hard, dry earth, his hands blistering. He set the crosses. They were stark against the blue sky. He had not carved names. He had no right. It was a gesture, a physical admission of the ghosts he had brought to his land. Lena came and stood a long way off, watching him. She saw the crosses. She saw the act of atonement. It was small. It was late, but it was not nothing. Her hand, in her pocket, rested on the silver watch. Taza appeared beside her, silent as smoke. He had returned from a wide circle of the property. He held something in his hand. It was not a shell casing this time. It was a heavy brass cartridge, identical to the one Dalton had placed on the auction post. "The scout left this," Taza said, "on your gate." Grant walked back from the crosses, his hands raw, wiping sweat from his face. He saw the bullet in Taza's hand. Dalton was marking his territory. He was reminding Grant that this land, too, was forfeit. Taza did not wait. "My trail is hot," he said. "The thieves, they are moving horses. There will be an exchange soon. In El Diablo Canyon, they are taking animals from settlers, and from my people. They are building a herd." A plan began to form, not from one of them, but from the spaces between the 3 of them. Grant said, "We need the law, the real law, not Dalton." Taza shook his head. "The law is a white man's paper. It has no power in the canyon, and it is Dalton's paper." Lena spoke, her voice cutting through their argument. "We need both." She looked at Grant. "You are a rancher. You have a name. Go to the town. Find the law you believe in, but do not go as a fighter. Go as a man looking for a paper of his own." Then she looked at Taza. "And you? Go to the canyon. Find the horses. Find their camp. But do not go as a warrior. Go as a shadow. We need to know what we are fighting." Grant looked at her, surprised by her command. "And you?" "Me," Lena said, her voice flat. "I am a woman with no name. I am a stray you bought. No one will look twice at me. I will go to the saloon, I will wash glasses, and I will listen." It was a dangerous, desperate plan. Grant hated it. He wanted to keep her safe, to hide her on the ranch, to protect the ghost he had finally found. He said, "No, it is too dangerous. Dalton will see you." Lena met his gaze, and the slate in her eyes was unyielding. "He saw me at the auction. He knows I am here. Hiding is what he wants. He will come for me when he is ready. I will not wait. I will go to him." Her choice was absolute. She would act. Grant saw his own cowardice in his desire to protect her. He saw that his protection was just another fence, another cage. Taza was right. Lena was choosing action. She was choosing the hard, open freedom. Grant nodded, his jaw tight. "I know a man," he said, "a lawyer. Hollis, he is old. He is honest. He fears no one. He will know if there is a legal way. A circuit judge, a federal marshal." Taza nodded once. "It is a good plan. You find your paper. I will find the thieves. She will find the voice." He looked at Lena. "Be careful in that place. A saloon is a trap. It is full of noise, but the real words are quiet." They split. Taza melted into the hills, moving east on foot, his pony hidden, his path a secret known only to the stones. Grant saddled his horse, his face grim, and rode for Mesquite Ford, a man going to find a piece of paper to fight a bullet. Lena waited. She washed her face. She braided her hair. She put on the one other dress she owned, a faded blue calico. She walked the miles to town. She did not look back at the ranch. The Golden Nugget Saloon was loud. Even in the afternoon, it smelled of stale beer, sweat, and cheap perfume. A player piano hammered out a tune, the notes tinny and false. Lena walked straight to the bar. A large woman with a tired, kind face was wiping a glass. Her name was May. She owned the place. "I need work," Lena said. "I can clean. I can serve. I am fast." May looked her up and down. She saw the pale scar on her wrist. She saw the lack of fear in her eyes. May had seen 100 women like her, women on the run from something. She said, "I do not need a server. I need someone to wash. The back room. You get paid in coin at the end of the night, and 1 meal." Lena nodded. "Thank you." She spent the next 3 hours in a cloud of steam, her hands raw from lye soap and scalding water. She worked without stopping, but she listened. The saloon was the town's living room. Deals were made over whiskey. Secrets were spilled. She heard men talk of cattle prices, of the drought, and then, through the swing door to the main room, she heard a voice she recognized. The deputy, the one who had fumbled with her key. He was talking to a man, his voice low and boastful. "Dalton has it all," the deputy said. "Every piece of paper." "What paper?" the other man slurred. "The book, the black ledger. He keeps it in his office, in the floor safe. Every name, every acre. Who it belonged to. Who it belongs to now." He laughed. "That book is the real deed to this whole county." Lena's hands stilled in the water. The ledger, the book of stolen land. Her family's name was in that book. She was sure of it. She pushed through the door, carrying a heavy tray of clean glasses. She kept her head down. She moved to the bar. May was there, drawing a beer. Lena set the glasses down. May spoke to her, her voice low, not looking at her. "I saw you at the auction," May said quietly. "I saw McCade buy you." Lena said nothing. "That was a fool thing he did," May went on, her back to Lena as she worked. "Or a brave one. I am not sure which." She slid a beer down the bar. She turned. She looked at Lena. "I knew his father, Angus." She said, "I saw his name, years ago, on a seizure notice, for the Cartwright place." Lena's blood turned to ice. Grant's father. He had been part of it. The half-truth at the oak tree was a whole lie. Before she could speak, the front doors of the saloon swung open. The piano stopped. The talk died. Sheriff Dalton stood in the doorway. He filled the space, his shadow falling long and black across the floor. His eyes scanned the room. He was not there for a drink. He was looking for someone. His gaze passed over May. It passed over the men at the bar. It passed over Lena. It stopped. He looked right at her. He had not expected her to be here. He had expected her to be hiding at the ranch. He smiled. That same cold, thin smile. "May," he said, his voice a predatory purr. "You have new help." Lena's heart was a hammer. She could not run. The front door was blocked by him. The back door was a dozen yards away. She picked up her empty tray, her movements deliberately slow. She turned her back to him. Dalton took a step into the room. Suddenly, from the street outside, there was a tremendous crash, a sound of glass shattering, followed by a man yelling. Dalton's head snapped toward the door. What in the hell? The deputy at the bar ran outside. "Sheriff, someone just threw a rock through the land office window." Dalton cursed. His attention pulled. He looked back at Lena. His eyes narrowed. Suspicious. He pointed a thick finger at her. "You stay." He strode out of the saloon, the deputy behind him. Lena let out a breath she did not know she was holding. She was shaking. May grabbed her arm. Her grip was like iron. "Go," she whispered. "Now, out the back. Do not come back." Lena ran. She ran through the kitchen, out the back door, and into the alley. She did not slow. She ran, her lungs burning, into the maze of backlots and alleys, heading for the open prairie. She did not see the figure that slipped from the roof of the saloon, silent as a hawk's shadow. Taza had not gone to the canyon. Not yet. He had followed Lena. He had watched. He had kept his promise. Freedom, he had said, must be guarded. He picked up the small, sharp rock he had used. He looked at the broken window of the land office. He had heard the deputy talking. Too. He had heard about the ledger. Now he knew where the paper was. Lena found the brass cartridge on her pillow when she returned to the small room Grant had given her. The bullet Dalton Scout had left at the gate. Grant must have put it there. A warning. She picked it up. She looked at the crude D. She went to the small table. With the tip of her father's pocket knife, she began to scratch into the soft brass. She carved, in small, sharp letters, a single word, right over the D. Return. She set the bullet on the windowsill. It was not a threat. It was a vow. The storm broke just after midnight. It did not come gently. It arrived with a crack of thunder that shook the stone house to its foundations. Rain followed. A solid, hammering sheet of water that turned the dry yard to a running river of red mud. Inside the main cabin, the three of them were trapped. The air was thick, hot, and smelled of wet wool and old smoke. Grant had returned an hour before, his face gray. The lawyer, Hollis, was gone. His office was shuttered, a notice tacked to the door claiming a family emergency in Austin. It was a lie. Dalton had gotten to him. The law Grant had ridden to find was just another empty building. Taza sat by the cold hearth, tending to the shallow graze on his arm. He had cleaned it with whiskey, his face impassive, but a tightness around his mouth spoke of the pain. Lena stood by the single window, watching the lightning bleach the yard white, then plunge it back into darkness. She had not spoken since Grant's return. She had listened to his report. She had processed the information from May, the fact of Angus McCade's signature on a seizure notice. She had processed the deputy's words about the ledger. It all formed a single, ugly picture. She turned from the window. She walked to the small table where Grant sat, his head in his hands. She reached into her pocket. Her hand came out, holding the heavy silver watch. She did not place it gently. She set it on the table. The sound, a solid, heavy click of silver on wood, cut through the drumming of the rain. The R, elegant and scrolling, was face up. Grant looked at it. He looked at her. "You told me you found me," Lena said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was more frightening than a scream. Grant's face was slick with sweat. "Lena, I—" "You did not tell me why the fire was set." She continued, her gaze locked on his. You told me you were too late, but May, at the saloon, she remembered. She told me about your father. Grant looked at the watch. He saw Robert Cartwright's face. He saw the flames. Taza stopped his work, watching them. Lena said, You told me half. Now you tell me the truth. The confession, when it came, was not a flood. It was a slow, agonizing leak. Every word costing him. My father, Angus McCade, he wanted your land. He said the water rights on your stretch of the creek were the key to the whole valley. He choked on the words. He and Dalton, they were in it together. They had been for years. Dalton handled the law. My father handled the money. They drew up false debt papers. They filed a seizure notice, the one May saw. He could not look at her. He stared at the watch. The fire, he whispered, the rain on the roof almost drowning him out. It was not a raid. It was Dalton, his men, to clear the land, to make the seizure final. Lena's hands, at her sides, curled into fists. Her knuckles were white. And you, she said. Grant flinched. The last piece? The worst piece. I knew, he said, his voice breaking. I knew they were going. I told myself it was just to scare him, to force your father to leave. But I rode over. I saw the glow. I was close enough. He looked up, his eyes ruined, pleading. I heard them. I heard your father shout. I heard him screaming, and I sat on my horse. In the trees. I sat there. I did nothing. I was a coward. I watched it burn. I watched it all burn. He looked away, toward the cold hearth. I found you, by the creek, and I was glad. You were alive, and I was terrified. Because you were alive. You were proof, so I bandaged you, and I rode away. I left you. The cabin was silent. The only sound was the roar of the storm outside. Lena did not move. She was shaking, a fine, violent tremor that ran from her shoulders to her hands. She looked at this old, broken man. He was not the monster who had set the fire. He was the man who had let it burn. She reached out and picked up the watch. She closed her fist around it, the metal cutting into her palm. Truth does not erase anything, she said. Her voice was thick, but it did not break. I will never forget the sound of that night. I will never forget the smell of the smoke. She took a ragged breath. But now I know who I am standing next to. It was not forgiveness. It was an assessment, a line drawn in the dirt. She had seen the bottom of him. Taza stood up. He walked to the table. The confession was air. It changed nothing. He looked at Lena. The deputy in the saloon, he said, he spoke of a ledger. Lena nodded, her composure returning, the tremor stopping. He called it a black ledger. In Dalton's office, in a floor safe. He said it holds every name, every stolen acre. Taza looked at Grant. Your paper law, he said, is in that book. Grant scrubbed his face. It is impossible. His office is locked, the safe. He is a paranoid man. We cannot. The town fair, Taza said. In 2 days, the town will be full. Music, drinking. They shoot fireworks. A plan began to form in the small, stifling room. A desperate, impossible plan. Taza said, the town will be looking at the sky. They will be loud. They will be blind. I can go over the roofs. The storage room window is old. Lena said, I can be there. I can get work, mending, a stall near the office. I can be the lookout. Grant looked at both of them. It is madness, stealing from the sheriff's office. Lena looked at him, her eyes cold. We are already dead in his eyes. He will not let me live, knowing who I am, and he will not let you live, knowing what you just said. He will come for us. Hiding here is just waiting to be buried. We get the book, or we die on this ranch. 2 nights later, the rain had passed, leaving the wide street of Mesquite Ford a sea of thick, sucking mud. The town fair was a small, brave circle of light and noise against the vast dark prairie. Torches flared, guttering in the wet breeze. A fiddle and a banjo scraped out a frantic, cheerful tune that sounded false and thin. Lena sat at a small, rickety table, a pile of mending in her lap. She had given the stall owner her last 2 coins for the space. Her needle worked back and forth, but her eyes were not on the cloth. They were on the dark alley beside the sheriff's office, 50 feet away. Grant moved through the crowd, his hat pulled low. He stopped at the shooting gallery. A line of 10 targets. He paid his nickel. He lifted the heavy rifle. He fired. The shot was loud. He missed. He missed again. Deliberately, he laughed. Too loud. He complained about the sights. A small crowd of drifters, bored and half-drunk, gathered to watch the old rancher make a fool of himself. Taza was a ghost. He had scaled the back wall of the general store. He moved across the wet, slippery shingles, his moccasins making no sound. He reached the sheriff's office. The storage room window was high. It was locked, but it was old. The wood was soft. He used his knife. A moment of pressure. The latch gave. He slipped inside, vanishing into the darkness. He moved through the dark office. He found the main room. He could hear the muffled pop of Grant's rifle. He could hear the fiddle. He found the rug by the desk. He pulled it back. The floor safe, a simple iron box, not a bank vault. He knelt. He listened. The music, the shouts. He used his knife again, and a thin, strong piece of wire he had taken from Grant's broken fence. He worked by touch. He felt the tumblers. A click, a second click. The handle turned. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, 1 book, bound in black leather, heavy. He had it. At that moment, Lena saw him. Sheriff Dalton. He was not at the fair. He was walking from the saloon, a deputy at his side. He was not smiling. He looked angry, suspicious. The broken window, Grant's questions, it had made him paranoid. He was heading straight for his office. Lena's heart stopped. Dalton reached the front door. He shoved his key in the lock. Taza was at the back door of the office, the book in his hand. He heard the front door open. Dalton strode in. He lit the lamp on his desk. He saw the disturbed rug. He saw the open safe. He roared. Taza threw the back door open and leaped into the alley. Dalton was right behind him. He raised his pistol. He fired. The night exploded. The bullet screamed past Taza's head, close enough to singe his hair. It tore a hot, burning line along his right shoulder. He stumbled. The ledger clutched to his chest. Grant heard the shot. He dropped the gallery rifle and ran. He rounded the corner into the alley. He saw Taza on one knee. He saw Dalton in the back doorway, raising his gun for a second. Careful shot. Grant drew his own pistol. He fired. He did not aim for the man. He aimed for the wood. The bullet struck the doorframe, sending a spray of splinters into Dalton's face. Dalton yelled, "Ducking back inside!" The fair went silent. The fiddle stopped. People screamed. Lena was moving. She had seen the flash, seen Taza fall. She grabbed the oil lamp from her own table. She ran to the mouth of the alley just as Dalton stepped back out, his face a mask of fury. Lena did not hesitate. She threw the lamp with all her strength. It shattered on the muddy boardwalk at Dalton's feet. Oil and flame erupted. A wall of fire and thick, black smoke filled the alley. Dalton jumped back, beating at the flames on his trousers. The deputy was shouting. Grant grabbed Taza by his good arm, hauling him to his feet. "Run!" he yelled. Lena had already vanished, swallowed by the panicked, screaming crowd. Grant and Taza plunged in after her. The 3 of them were gone, melted into the chaos, leaving only mud, fire, and the dying, frantic music of the fair. They did not stop running for miles. They found shelter in a dry arroyo, far from the town, the glow of the fair a faint, ugly smear against the clouds. The rain began again, a cold, steady drizzle. Taza leaned against the dirt wall. breathing hard. Grant tore his own shirt, his hands shaking, and pressed the cloth against Taza's bleeding shoulder. It was a graze, painful but not deep. Lena took the book from Taza. Her hands were steady. The black leather was soaked, slick with rain. She opened it. Grant struck a match, shielding the small flame with his hands. Page after page. Names, dates, acres. The truth of a decade of theft. Lena saw her own family's name. Cartwright, seized for non-payment of debt. The rain dripped onto the page. The ink began to run. The truth was dissolving. Lena, frantic, turned the pages. At the very back, tucked into a leather sleeve, a single, folded document. It was mostly dry. She unfolded it. It was a contract, a bill of sale, for all water rights associated with the Cartwright homestead. And at the bottom, a signature. Robert Cartwright. Lena stared at it. Her hand went to her pocket, to the watch. She knew that signature. She had traced it 1,000 times. "This," she whispered, "is not his name. It is a forgery." Grant leaned closer. He saw the crude, looping signature, and below it, impressed into the paper, a circular stamp, the official seal of the Mesquite Ford Sheriff's Office, and a signature he recognized. "Sheriff Dalton." "He forged it." Grant breathed. "He forged your father's name, and he stamped it. He made it law." They had it. The proof. Taza looked at the paper. He looked at his bleeding arm. He looked back toward the distant, hidden town. "That paper is Dalton's voice," Taza said, his voice hard. "In his town. His voice is the only one. This paper is a ghost. It has no power there." He turned his gaze to the east. The sky was dark, but he knew what was there. A black, jagged line of mountains against the horizon. "But there is a place," he said, "a place the white man's law does not go. El Diablo Canyon. There, my brothers can make the truth be heard." The air before dawn was cold and sharp, smelling of wet stone and the faint, green scent of bruised chaparral. The rain had passed, leaving the world scoured and clean. Taza led them east. He moved not with the urgency of a man fleeing, but with the steady, ground-covering purpose of a man who knew his destination. His shoulder, bound tightly with cloth Grant had provided, was a dark, stiff shape under his shirt. He did not complain. He did not slow. Grant rode behind him, his body aching. The confession in the cabin had hollowed him out, but the theft of the ledger had filled that hollow space with a new, terrible energy. He was no longer just a man running from a ghost. He was a man carrying evidence. Lena rode last. She carried the ledger. She had dried the pages as best she could by the small fire in the arroyo. The ink blurred but legible. The forged water contract was safe, tucked inside the cover. The entire book was now wrapped in Grant's oilcloth slicker, tied to her saddle horn. It was a heavy, physical weight. It was her past, and it was the only key to her future. The rising sun did not bring warmth. It brought light, and light was exposure. They had left the rolling plains behind and were entering the broken lands. The mouth of El Diablo Canyon was a dark, jagged crack in the earth, a place the flat prairie sunlight did not want to touch. The trail Taza followed was not a trail at all. It was a series of choices, a path visible only to him, through washes and over ridges of shattered rock. Lena proved her strength. She had been raised on this land, and it showed. She moved her mare with a quiet skill, her body balanced, her hands light on the reins. She watched Taza. She watched the rocks. She listened to the silence. Grant watched her. He saw no fear in her, only a grim, patient focus. The first shot came from above. It was a sharp, flat crack, not the heavy boom of Dalton's pistol. It was a rifle. The bullet screamed off a rock 20 feet from Taza, sending up a spray of stone dust. Instantly, Taza was off his pony. pulling the animal into the cover of a massive boulder. Grant and Lena did the same, their hearts hammering. "Look," Lena said, her voice a low command. High on the canyon rim, stark against the new blue sky, were 4 riders. They were not moving. They were watching. Dalton's men. The man with the rattlesnake hatband was among them. They were not just chasing. They were waiting. They had been sent ahead. Taza studied the ridge. He looked at the narrow, steep path ahead. The only way forward. It was a trap. He turned to Grant and Lena. His voice was quiet, urgent. "You must take the high path. Now. Keep moving. Do not stop." Grant looked at the men on the ridge. "They will shoot us down." Taza shook his head. "They are waiting for us to stop. They want the book. They do not want to destroy it. They will not shoot at the book." He looked at Lena. He pointed to a different trail, a smaller one that seemed to vanish into a sheer wall of rock. "A goat path. I will take this trail. I will draw them. When they follow me, you will ride. Fast." Grant began to object, to speak of another plan. "There is no other plan," Lena said. She looked at Taza, a complete, terrible understanding in her eyes. She unwrapped the oilcloth from her horn and slung the heavy ledger over her own shoulder, the strap cutting into her. She was ready. Taza put one hand on his pony's neck. He gave a sharp, barking call, a sound like a high plains coyote. He leapt into his saddle and spurred the horse, not toward the high path, but directly up the scramble of loose rock. It was a desperate, impossible climb. The men on the ridge shouted. They saw the lone Apache, the guide, trying to escape. The rattlesnake hatband man pointed. He and 2 others spurred their horses, disappearing from the rim, moving to cut Taza off. "Now," Lena said. She kicked her mare into a gallop, her body low over the horse's neck. Grant was right behind her. They charged for the high path, a narrow shelf of rock carved into the cliff face. They heard shouting behind them, and another rifle shot, this one wild. The 4th rider on the rim was firing at them, but he was too far, and they were moving too fast. They rounded a bend, and the canyon wall protected them. The path was barely wide enough for 1 horse. On their left was the sheer, rising wall of rock. On their right, a 1,000-foot drop to the canyon floor. They slowed to a walk, the horses picking their way carefully over the loose shale. The sound of their hooves was a small, clicking noise in the vast, terrible silence. Taza, meanwhile, was fighting for his life. The 3 men had met him in a small, rocky basin. They spread out, trying to corner him. The man with the rattlesnake hatband drew his pistol. Taza did not draw a weapon. He uncoiled a short, heavy rope from his belt. It was not a lariat. It was a mescalero throwing thong, a weapon of speed and precision. The man spurred his horse, raising his pistol. Taza's arm blurred. The thong uncoiled like a striking snake. The weighted end found its mark, wrapping around the man's gun hand and wrist. Taza pulled. A sharp, violent jerk. The man was ripped from his saddle. He fell, his head striking the rocks with a sickening, solid sound. He did not move. The other 2 men reined in, their horses rearing, their faces a mask of shock. Taza did not wait. He spurred his pony past them, up another narrow crevice, and was gone. He had bought the time they needed. On the high path, the ground was wet and unstable from the night's rain. Grant and Lena moved with agonizing slowness. They could hear nothing but the wind and the sound of small rocks skittering down the cliff face. Then a section of the path in front of them gave way. It did not slide. It simply fell, vanishing into the air below. Lena's mare saw it and stopped, her ears flat. Behind her, Grant's horse shied. The animal bumped the cliff wall, lost its footing on the loose shale. The horse stumbled. Grant, 56 years old and exhausted, was thrown. He did not go over the edge. He fell onto the path, but he slid on the loose rock. He slid toward the open air. He cried out. A short, sharp sound of pure terror. His hands clawed at the stone. They found no purchase. Lena was off her horse in an instant. The ledger, slung on her back, swung wildly. She lunged. She grabbed the front of his shirt with one hand. The cloth ripped. She grabbed his wrist with the other. She dug her boots into the shale. Her body braced. He was a heavy man. His weight and the pull of the slide was dragging her toward the edge with him. She could feel her boots slipping. Grant looked up at her. His face was white. He saw her face, a mask of terrible effort, her teeth bared. He was inches from the fall. His life was in the hands of the woman whose family he had watched to be destroyed. He saw the crescent scar on her wrist, pulled tight as she held him. "Pull!" she screamed. Her voice was not a plea. It was a raw, furious command. "Pull!" His boot found a small, solid piece of rock. He pushed. She pulled, her entire body straining, the muscles in her arm burning as if they would tear from the bone. He scrambled, his other hand finding her arm. He was not a dead weight. He was fighting. With a final, gasping sob of effort, she hauled him back. They collapsed together on the narrow path, breathing in ragged, tearing gasps, their limbs tangled. They were covered in grit, inches from death. Grant could not speak. He looked at his wrist, where the print of her fingers was already turning red. He looked at her face. He had trusted her with his life, and she had not let him fall. The power between them had shifted. The debt was no longer his alone. She pushed herself up. She retrieved the mare. She got back in the saddle. She did not speak. She just nodded her head forward. They had to keep moving. Grant, shaking, pulled himself onto his horse. He followed her. Taza met them a mile later. He appeared from the rocks, his face grim. The graze on his shoulder was bleeding again. He said nothing of his fight. He simply took the lead. The path widened. It led them down into a protected bowl-shaped valley inside the larger canyon. The walls here were smooth, and they were covered in paintings, red and yellow and white, hundreds of hands, stenciled on the rock, images of deer, of hunters, of the sky. In the center of this sacred place, under a great overhang of rock, sat an old man. He was thin, his face a beautiful map of wrinkles. He was Nalin, an elder of Taza's people. Taza dismounted. He approached Nalin with reverence, and he spoke in their own language. He spoke for a long time. He gestured to Grant. He gestured to Lena. He pointed back the way they had come. Then he turned to Lena. He said, "The book." Lena unslung the oilcloth package. She was stiff, her arm aching from the strain of Grant's weight. She walked forward and handed the ledger to Nalin. Nalin took it. He did not open it. He held it in his lap, his hands resting on the dark leather. He looked at Grant, his eyes deep and clear, seeing everything, all the guilt, all the fear. Then he looked at Lena. "This is your memory," he said. His English was slow, perfect. Lena nodded. "It is." "A memory is truth," Nalin said, "and truth must be guarded by all the people." He placed the ledger in a dry, safe crevice in the rock wall, beside other, older bundles wrapped in hide. It was safe. A shout echoed from the canyon rim. "Dalton!" He was there, but he was below. He and a dozen men, the main posse, were on the canyon floor. They had ridden hard. They looked up at the high, protected valley. They could not reach it. The path Grant and Lena had used was the only way in. And it was blocked by Taza, who now stood at the entrance with his bow. Dalton's face, even from a distance, was purple with rage. He had been tricked. The ledger was gone, safe where he could not get it. "McCade," he roared, his voice bouncing off the walls. "Give me that book." Grant stepped forward. He stood beside Taza. He said nothing. Dalton saw his defiance. He saw Lena. He saw Nalin. He knew he had lost, for now. He snarled, a sound of pure animal fury. He barked an order. His men dismounted. They had torches. They began to light the tall, dry grass that choked the canyon floor. Grant's blood ran cold. Fire. It was always fire. The wind, which always followed a storm, was blowing up the canyon. It pushed the flames, and a massive column of oily, black smoke straight toward them. The fire was a roaring, living thing, consuming the dry grass, leaping up the cliff face. Lena cried out, her hand flying to her mouth. The smell, the acrid, burning smell. She was 17 again, by the creek, choking on smoke. She froze, her eyes wide with terror. Grant grabbed her arm. Lena, it is not the same. Look at me. But she could not. She was trapped in the memory. Taza was not watching the fire. He was watching the wind. He held a wet finger in the air. He saw the smoke swirl, twist. The sun was higher. The rock was heating. The wind will turn, he said. It always does. He grabbed a long, dry branch of mesquite. He ran to the edge of their valley and lit the end of it in the approaching flames. He ran back to the low end of their sanctuary, and he touched the burning branch to the dry grass below them. A new fire sprang to life. Grant shouted, "What are you doing? You will burn us all!" Taza ignored him. He ran along the edge of the valley, dragging the burning branch, creating a long, curved line of new fire. This fire, smaller, weaker, was instantly sucked downward by the draft of the main inferno. It raced down the slope, away from them. It burned a black, empty scar on the land. The two fires met, Dalton's massive blaze, and Taza's small, smart one. They met with a roar that shook the air, and then, with nothing left to burn, the fire line died. Smoke, thick and choking, washed over them for a moment, and then it cleared. Taza's backfire had worked. It had created a bare, black buffer of burned earth. The fire was past them. They were safe. The horses, the ledger, the people, all safe. They stood, coughing, their faces black with soot, their eyes red and streaming. They had walked through the fire. Below, Dalton watched. He saw them emerge from the smoke, alive, defiant. He saw his last, best weapon fail. He had lost. He shook his fist, a gesture of pure, impotent hatred. "This is not over. McCade," he screamed, "I will have that paper if it costs me your life." He wheeled his horse, his posse gathering around him. They rode away, defeated. Silence fell in the high valley. Nayland had not moved. He sat calm, as if he had been watching a change in the weather. Grant looked at Lena. Her face was a mess of soot and tear tracks, but her eyes were not the eyes of the girl at the creek. They were hard. They were clear. "He will never stop," Grant said. She wiped her face. "Leaving a streak of black. He has the law in his pocket, but we have the truth." Taza came and stood with them. He looked at the ledger, safe in its stone niche. "We have shown them we can hide. Now we must show them we can stand." Grant looked at Lena. He no longer felt the need to protect her. He felt the need to stand with her. "We go back," Grant said. His voice was new. It was not the voice of a coward. "We take the ledger. We take the forgery. We go to the county court." Lena looked at the black soot on her own hands. Fire had destroyed her life. Today, it had burned away the last of her fear. "We will not be guerrillas," she said, finishing his thought. "We will be witnesses." The journey back from El Diablo Canyon was a descent into a different kind of danger. They skirted the high ridges, avoiding the main trails, moving only in the gray hours of dusk and pre-dawn. They were no longer the hunted. They were the hunters. And their prey was the law itself. Taza, with Nolan's blessing, had retrieved the true ledger. It was a heavy, terrifying burden, wrapped again in Grant's oilcloth. The circuit judge was in Mesquite Ford, The trial was set for the next day. Dalton, furious and overconfident, had posted the notice himself. He wanted a public spectacle. He wanted to make an example of Grant McCade. They did not go to the ranch. Taza knew a place. A small, collapsed line shack, built decades ago by a forgotten trapper, hidden in a thicket of cottonwoods where the Pecos bent south. It was a single room, the roof mostly gone, but one corner was dry. It was there they would wait for the morning. The storm had truly passed. The air was cool and clean, and the sky was a deep, polished black, so thick with stars it seemed more white than dark. The sound of the river, still swollen from the rain, was a low, constant roar. Taza took the first watch. He did not stand near the shack. He vanished into the dense shadows of the cottonwoods, his bow in hand. He moved to a place where he could see the river and the trail, a guardian for their small, fragile patch of truth. He stood, unmoving, and listened. He heard the river. He heard the rustle of a possum in the leaf litter. Far off, a lone wolf called, a high, mournful sound that spoke of open spaces and boundaries. Taza heard it and was calm. He remembered his mother's words, spoken to him as a boy. Freedom is not a space. It is a thing you must guard. Every day, every night. He was guarding it now. Inside the ruin, Grant built a fire so small it was barely a handful of embers, just enough to break the deep chill. The light was a faint, trembling orange, painting their faces with shadow. Lena sat on a dry saddle blanket, her back against the rough wood wall. Grant sat opposite her, tending the small flames. He looked at his hands. They were raw from the climb in the canyon. The skin on his palms blistered and red from the heat of the backfire. He had failed to protect her from the fire 8 years ago, and he had just led her through another tomorrow. He was leading her into Dalton's courtroom. "Lena," he said, his voice low, gravelly. She looked at him. "We do not have to do this. We have the book. We can ride. We can be in Austin in a week. We can give it to the federal marshals. You would be safe." Lena watched him for a long moment. She saw the deep, honest fear in his eyes. He was not afraid for himself. He was afraid for her. He was still trying to undo the past. And what would that be? "Grant," she asked, her voice quiet. "Running? Is that not what you did for 8 years? Is that not what I did? I ran until I had nowhere left to run but that barn." She leaned forward, into the small circle of light. "Dalton knows my name. He knows my face. He knows I am the last Cartwright. There is no place in Texas, no place in this whole country. I would be safe. He would hunt me. He would send men. He would never, ever stop." She shook her head. "No, I am done running. I would rather die in that courtroom, speaking the truth, than die in an alley in Austin, looking over my shoulder." The finality in her voice settled the matter. He nodded, his guilt shifting to a grim resolve. Lena looked down at his hands, at the raw, red skin. He had pushed them into the hot earth, beating out stray embers from the backfire to keep them from spreading. She shifted, moving from her side of the fire to his. She sat beside him. He did not look at her. He was ashamed of his weakness, his fear. She reached out. She did not hesitate. She gently took his right hand, the one that was burned worst. She held it, her fingers light, her own calloused skin brushing his. He flinched, startled, but did not pull away. He looked at their hands. His, large, scarred, and damaged, held by hers, smaller, but just as strong. He felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the first gentle human touch he had felt in 8 years that was not an accident or an obligation. He looked at her face. Only inches from his, the soot was gone, but her skin was still smudged, her hair a wild tangle from the canyon. Her eyes were clear. They were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a partner. He had never seen anyone so beautiful. She saw the change in his face, She saw the shame fall away, replaced by a raw, unguarded emotion. She leaned forward. Slowly, she gave him every chance to turn away. He did not move. He watched her, his breath held. She kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of profound, desperate, shared humanity. It was slow. It was a sealing of the truth they had just spoken. It was the taste of smoke and river water and survival. She pulled back, only an inch. Her forehead rested against his. "If we do not come back tomorrow," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "Thank you." He was trembling. "For what?" "For choosing the truth," she said, finally. He closed his eyes. He felt a cleansing, a sort of peace he had not known since before the fire. He was no longer a coward. He opened his eyes. He looked at her wrist. Beside the pale, crescent scar, there was a small, faded cord of tied cloth. It was old, frayed, a small charm. A piece of blue stone was tied into it. He touched it, his fingers brushing the scar and the cord. "It was just a thing I found," she said, her voice still a whisper. I have always worn it." He met her gaze. His voice was thick. "May I?" It was a question. It was permission. It was the one thing he had never asked for. She nodded. His rough, blistered fingers worked at the small, tight knot. He was slow. He was gentle. He did not want to break it. The knot gave. He slid the cord from her wrist. He held it in his palm, a small, useless, powerful thing, a binding. He let it fall to the dirt floor. It was an unchaining. It was a quiet, profound act of liberation. Freely given, freely received. The debt, the sale, the $20 gold, it all dissolved. The auction was over. Lena looked at her wrist. It was bare, except for the scar. She felt lighter. She turned and picked up her father's silver watch from her blanket. She placed it on the flat stone of the ruined window frame. The R facing the room. It stood guard, watching over them as the river and the stars and Taza watched over the night. Grant reached for the single lamp. His fingers brushed the small metal wheel. The flame sank, and with a soft sigh, went out, leaving the two of them in the deep, quiet, starlit dark. The knock came 2 hours before dawn. It was not a knock. It was a scratching, like a branch on the wood. In an instant, Taza was at the opening, his bow drawn. Grant was on his feet, his pistol in his hand, shielding Lena. "May," Taza's voice said, low. May stumbled in, her face pale, her shawl clutched tight. She was breathing hard, mud on the hem of her dress. "How did you find us?" Grant demanded. "I guessed," she panted. "I guessed you were not stupid enough to go to the ranch and not brave enough to stay in town. The river was the only path. I followed it." She was terrified. She looked at Lena, her eyes wide. "You cannot go to the court. It is a trap." "What are you talking about?" Grant said. "The judge is here." May shook her head, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. "This came to me, from a man who owes me. He works at the jail." She handed it to Grant. Grant unfolded it. It was a scrawl. "Hollis, the lawyer. They arrested him. Drunk. Dalton's men, they beat him. He is in a cell. He cannot help you." Grant's stomach turned to ice. "Without Hollis." "That is not the worst of it," May said, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "The judge, Judge Thorne, he is not at the hotel. He is staying at Dalton's house. I saw them, not an hour ago, on the porch, drinking, laughing. Dalton, he put his arm around the judge's shoulder. They are friends." The room was utterly silent. The trial was a sham. It was a stage. Dalton was not planning to defend himself. He was planning to welcome them, to let them present the stolen ledger, and then have the judge, his friend, declare it stolen property. He would have them arrested. He would get the book back. They would be hanged by the end of the day. Grant sank onto the blanket. It is over. It is over. He has won. Lena looked at the watch on the windowsill, its silver case catching the first faint gray light of the coming dawn. "No," Taza said. They both looked at him. He was standing in the doorway, the light behind him. "Nalin is an old man," Taza said. "He has seen the white man's law. He has seen it lie. He did not trust it." He stepped inside. From a pouch on his belt, he pulled a different book. It was smaller, thinner. The cover was just rough hide. Grant's brow furrowed. "What is that?" "We sat in the canyon." Taza said, "I ground berries for ink. I used the soot from the fire. I am a good artist. I know the marks your people make." He held it out. Grant took it. He opened it. Page after page. It was a copy. Taza had copied the essential pages. The names, the dates. He had copied the Cartwright entry. And on the last page, he had made a perfect, careful drawing of the forged contract, right down to the shape of Dalton's seal. "It is a copy," Grant breathed. "It is worthless." "No," Lena said. She stood up, her eyes blazing. "It is not worthless." Grant looked at her. "The original is the proof," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But this is the truth. The courtroom is a trap. You are right. Dalton wants the original book. He will do anything to get it." She looked at Taza, then at Grant. "So we do not give it to him. We leave the original with Nalin. We let the people, Taza's people, guard the proof, and we walk into that courtroom with this." "But, Lena," Grant stammered, "they will know it is a copy. The judge will throw it out." "Let him," she said. "Let him. We are not there to win a legal fight. We are there to speak. We will bring May. We will bring the other families Dalton's deputy talked about. We will tell the story. We will make him deny it in front of the whole town. We will use this copy to start a fire we can control." Grant looked at the hand-drawn pages. It was a desperate, insane plan. It was the only one they had. He looked at Taza. He looked at May. He looked at Lena. He saw the fire in her eyes, the one the canyon could not burn out. He stood up. He put his hand out, palm up, in the center of the small room. "For the truth," he said, "whatever the cost." Taza placed his hand on Grant's. Lena placed her hand on top of theirs. May, her fear replaced by a cold anger, put her hand on the pile. The sun was rising. It was time. The courtroom in Mesquite Ford was not a hall of justice. It was a small, square room, built of new pine that had already warped in the heat. It smelled of raw wood, sweat, and chewing tobacco. The air was hot, and the flies buzzed, lazy and fat, against the tall, dirty windows. At the front, on a raised platform, sat Judge Thorne. He was a large man, his face pink, his white shirt straining over a prosperous belly. He looked comfortable. He looked rested. He had, as May reported, enjoyed Dalton's hospitality. Sheriff Dalton himself was not at a defendant's table. He stood near the jury box, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his star polished. He owned this room. His deputies, 4 of them, including the one with the rattlesnake hatband, stood at the doors. They were the guards. They were the law. The jury was seated, 12 men, a bootmaker, a feed store owner, 2 ranchers Grant knew were deep in debt to Dalton's bank. They were pale men. They were intimidated men. They looked at their own hands, at the floor, anywhere but at the judge or the sheriff. The doors opened. Grant, Lena, Taza, and May walked in. A low murmur rippled through the room. The sight of them, the ruined rancher, the ghost of the Cartwright fire, the saloon owner, and an Apache warrior. Taza moved with a fluid, silent grace that was an insult to the room's rigid, fearful authority. He did not look like a prisoner. He looked like a guardian. They sat on the first hard bench. Dalton watched them. He saw the thin, hide-bound book in Grant's hands. He smiled. He knew it was a copy. His scout from the canyon had reported it. He thought they were fools. He thought this was a desperate, pathetic bluff. Judge Thorne banged his gavel. The sound was flat in the thick air. He read the charge. Grant McCade, theft of county property, conspiracy, incitement to riot. It was a list designed to hang a man. Before Grant could stand, before the judge could ask for a plea, the courtroom doors swung open again. It was not one person. It was a crowd. May had done her work. It was the blacksmith, the laundress, the farrier who had lost his shop. It was the small, dusty homesteaders from the auction, the families who had been pushed off their land. It was the poor, the dispossessed, the invisible people of Mesquite Ford. They filed in, quiet, their faces grim. They filled the benches. They stood along the back wall. Dalton's smile tightened. This was not his audience. The room was no longer his. It was full of the people he had robbed. The air pressure changed. Judge Thorne, visibly annoyed, banged his gavel again. Order. A woman stood up from the crowd. A thin woman in a faded black dress. Mrs. Abel. Her husband had died 3 months ago. She said, her voice shaking but high, "Your Honor, I must speak." Judge Thorne glared. "You are out of order. Madam, sit down." She did not sit. She pointed a trembling finger at Dalton. "He seized my land. He said my husband had a debt. My Samuel owed no man. We had the paper. He took it." Dalton motioned to a deputy. The rattlesnake hatband man moved toward her. "Mrs. Abel cried out as he grabbed her arm. "It was a false paper. He stole it." May stood up. "Let her speak. Judge." The entire room murmured. The sound was like the buzz of angry hornets. The jury, for the first time, looked up. They looked at Mrs. Abel. They knew her. Thorne, his face turning from pink to red, hammered his gavel. Silence. He pointed at Grant. "Mr. McCade, you are charged. How do you—" Grant did not stand. Lena stood first. All eyes went to her. Judge Thorne squinted. "And you are—" "My name is Lena Cartwright," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear as a bell. It cut through the heat. Dalton's smile was gone. 8 years ago, Lena continued. She did not look at the judge. She looked at the jury. My home was burned to the ground. My mother and father were killed. The room was so quiet. The buzz of a single fly was a roar. I was told it was a raid. I was told it was an accident. It was a lie. Dalton was on his feet. "Objection. This is irrelevant. She is hysterical." Judge Thorne, grateful, said, sustained, "Young woman, get to the point, or you will be held in contempt." "The point," Lena said, her gaze unwavering, "is that the fire was set to cover the theft of our land, a theft arranged by and profited by Sheriff Dalton." The room erupted. Men stood up, shouting. Dalton roared for order. Lena's voice sliced through the chaos. "I know this because he kept a record, a black ledger. He listed every family he stole. He listed my father. He listed Mrs. Abel. I demand that ledger be brought as evidence." It was a brilliant move. She had accused him and offered his own book as the proof. Dalton laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You demand it? You mean the book you stole from my office?" "Yes," Lena said. The judge looked at Dalton, his expression a mixture of confusion and anger. This was not the simple trial he had been promised. Grant stood up. He held the thin, hide-bound book Taza had made. He said, "We have the book." Dalton sneered. "That is not my ledger. That is a child's drawing." "It is a copy," Grant said. His voice was not the voice of a broken man. It was the voice of a man who had left the past behind, a copy of the truth. Judge Thorne scoffed, his confidence returning. He saw his opening. "A copy is not evidence. This court does not deal in pictures and hearsay. This is a farce. Then let me testify to what I know. Grant said. He did not ask. He stated. He turned, like Lena, away from the judge. And he faced the town. My name is Grant McCade, and I am a coward. The confession hung in the dead, still air. I was there, Grant said, his voice raw, shaking with the force of the words. I was there the night the Cartwright Ranch burned. I knew it was happening. My father, Angus McCade, was partners with Sheriff Dalton. They wanted the water rights. A collective gasp went through the room. It was the town's secret, the root of its sickness, spoken aloud. I watched it burn. Grant cried out. I heard them, and I did nothing. I sat on my horse and I did nothing. I was silent. He looked at Dalton, his face a mask of shame and fury. I have been silent for 8 years. He paused, and his voice dropped, hard as iron. Today, I am silent no more. It was a moral explosion. It shattered the courtroom's fragile authority. Dalton saw the faces of the jury. He saw the faces of the town. He was losing. The law was failing him. He roared, He has confessed to conspiracy. He is mad. He nodded to the rattlesnake hatband man. Seize the book! Seize them all! Arrest them! The deputy lunged. He was fast. He grabbed for the copy in Grant's hand. He never touched it. Taza moved. He was not a man. He was a brown blur, an uncoiling of pure speed. He did not draw a knife. He did not strike. He moved inside the deputy's lunge, used the man's own weight, and simply tripped him. The deputy, all momentum and no balance, crashed headfirst into the wooden railing of the jury box. He fell in a heap, stunned. Another deputy, by the main door, saw his chance. He saw the Apache. He drew his pistol. He yelled, Apache! He raised the gun. A shot cracked through the room. The deputy by the door screamed. A high, thin sound. He grabbed his shoulder, his pistol clattering to the floor. He had not fired. At the back of the room, May stood, her arm outstretched. In her hand, a small, silver derringer. Smoke coiled from its tiny barrel. That is enough, May roared, her voice more powerful than the judge's gavel. Everyone froze. You will sit down, Judge Thorne, May commanded. Thorne, his face white as paper, stared at her. You say that book is a copy, May shouted, pointing at the hide ledger in Grant's hand. You say it is a lie. She pointed to the door. 2 of her bartenders, large men, carried in a heavy wooden chest, the kind used for storing whiskey. They dropped it on the floor with a heavy thud. I run a saloon, May said, walking forward. I see every deal. I keep every receipt. When Dalton and his men got drunk, they talked. They made deals. They left their papers. She threw the lid of the chest open. It was full, stuffed with paper, letters, receipts, contracts. Here, she yelled. She plunged her hand in and pulled out a yellowed letter. A letter from Sheriff Dalton to Angus McCade, discussing the, quote, removal of the Cartwrights, with Dalton's signature. She threw it on the judge's desk. And here, the real seizure notice for Mrs. Abel's land, stamped with Dalton's own seal. She threw that down, too. It was an avalanche. Corroboration. Proof. The copy Taza had made was suddenly, undeniably true. Dalton was cornered. He looked at his wounded deputy. He looked at May. He looked at the chest. The courtroom doors opened one more time. The crowd at the back parted, moving in silence. Nalin, the Mescalero elder, walked in. He was not alone. Behind him were 24 of Taza's people, their faces calm, painted for ceremony, not war, and behind them, a dozen white settlers, men from the high country, men who lived near the canyon, men who traded with Nalin's people. It was not a posse. It was a community. Nalin walked. his moccasins silent. All the way to the front, he stopped before the judge's bench. In his hands, he held the original black leather ledger. Dalton's face went white. He stared at the book. It was his, the real one. Nowlin looked at the judge. He looked at Taza's copy. He looked at May's chest of letters. "A man's book can lie," Nayland said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "A man's memory can fail." He held the original ledger up, for the jury, for the town, to see. "But the truth is the memory of many." He placed the real, black ledger on the judge's desk. It landed with a solid, heavy, final sound. The evidence was absolute. The copy, the corroboration, the original. Judge Thorne was trapped. He looked at Dalton, who was staring at the book, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred. He looked at the jury, who were all on their feet. He looked at the packed courtroom, at May's gun, at Nayland's escort. His friendship was worthless. His career, his life, was over if he did not break. He slammed his gavel, his hands shaking so hard he almost missed the block. "In light," he stammered, his voice a squeak. "In light of this overwhelming evidence, this new testimony." He was sweating, his eyes darting to the door. "This court finds probable cause. I'm ordering Sheriff Dalton arrested, pending a full investigation by the state marshal." He pointed, his finger trembling, at the two remaining uninjured deputies. "Seize him." The deputies looked at Dalton. They looked at the crowd. They looked at Taza. They saw their world ending. Slowly, their hands went to their pistols. They unbuckled their gun belts. They let them fall. They would not arrest him, but they would not defend him. Grant stepped forward. He picked up the pistol from the wounded deputy. He handed it to Taza. Taza took it. He walked to Dalton. He did not point the gun. He just held it. Dalton did not move. He was a broken man. He stared at Lena, his eyes burning with a hate that was all he had left. Judge Thorne banged his gavel again. "And this jury will issue an immediate freeze on all property seizures, effective immediately. This court is adjourned." The room was silent for a count of 3. Then, not a cheer, a sigh. A massive, shuddering exhalation of breath from 100 lungs. The terror, years of it, was broken. Lena walked forward. She passed Dalton, who was now being held by Grant. She went to the witness stand. She had brought the small, brass cartridge, the one she had carved, the one Dalton's scout had left. She held it out to the terrified court clerk. "Evidence," she said. The clerk took it. The bullet, the symbol of his threat, was now the last nail in his coffin. The crowd began to move, to file out, talking in low, shocked voices. They were blinking, emerging from the dark, hot trap of the courtroom. Grant, Lena, and Taza stood together. May joined them, her derringer tucked away. They walked to the door, Nayland and his people parting to let them pass. They stepped outside, onto the muddy street. The sun was high in the sky. It was bright and clean. The air smelled of wet earth and the distant river. The town of Mesquite Ford, for the first time in a decade, could breathe. The bullet that May fired in the courtroom was the last echo of the war Mesquite Ford had been fighting with itself. The man who died was a deputy named Corman, a man with a wife and 2 children, a man who had followed Dalton not out of malice, but out of weakness. His funeral was 2 days later. It was a simple, awkward, and necessary thing. The town gathered in the small cemetery, the raw pine box resting beside a new grave. The preacher, a man who had kept his sermons quiet and safe for years, now spoke of grief, of complex truths, and of the hard, painful work of healing. May was there, in the front row, her face set like stone. She had not slept. She had done what was necessary, and she would live with the weight of it. She had saved the room, but she had taken a life. Grant and Lena stood at the back of the crowd, near the gate. They were not victors. They were just survivors, their presence a quiet testament to the cause of the violence. When the preacher finished, and the first shovelfuls of dirt struck the wood, Taza moved. He stepped forward from the shadow of a live oak, moving through the crowd, which parted for him. A ripple of fear and curiosity. He stopped at the head of the grave. He wore no paint, no weapons. He carried only a small hide pouch. He knelt, dipped his fingers into the pouch, and brought them out stained with dark red ochre. He reached down, past the flowers and the dirt, and pressed his open palm firmly onto the lid of the pine box. He stood, leaving a perfect red handprint. He did not speak. He did not need to. It was not a white man's gesture. It was not a prayer. It was a mark. It was an acknowledgement. This death, this man, this violence was now part of the shared memory, a story that belonged to all of them, settler and Apache, victim and victor. It was the first act of a new, shared history. Taza turned, his gaze meeting Nolan's at the edge of the cemetery, and then he melted back into the trees. A week later, the real law arrived. He was not a judge and not a marshal. He was a state commissioner from Austin, a thin, tired man named Davies, who wore a suit and carried a locked leather briefcase. He had read Judge Thorne's frantic, self-serving report. He had heard the rumors. He spent 4 full days in the sheriff's office. He had the black ledger. He had May's wooden chest of receipts, an avalanche of corroboration. He had the bullet Lena had marked return. He sent for Nolan, and they spoke for 3 hours. He summoned May, who told her story with a flat, iron certainty. He summoned Grant, who confessed his silence. He summoned Lena, who simply told the truth. On the 5th day, he called a town meeting, not in the courtroom. He stood on the steps of the general store. The whole town gathered in the muddy street. "The findings are clear," Davies said, his voice dry, carrying in the still air. "The land seizures orchestrated by Sheriff Dalton are void. Every single one." A sound went through the crowd, a low, disbelieving sigh. He held up a stack of papers. "The original titles, validated by my office, will be returned. A full investigation into this corruption is underway. It does not end here. It ends in Austin. It ends when every man in this ring is found." He called the first name, Mrs. Abel. The widow walked forward, her hands shaking. Davies handed her the deed to her land. She held it to her chest and wept, the first tears of relief she had shed in a year. He called other names, the farrier, the blacksmith. Then, he said, Lena Cartwright. Lena stepped forward. The crowd parted for her. Davies held out the paper. 800 acres? He said, "Registered to your father, Robert Cartwright, fully restored, including all original water rights." Lena took the paper. It was heavy. It was real. It was 8 years too late, and it was right on time. The next day, Grant and Lena rode back to the McCade ranch. Grant was quiet. He held the deed to his own land, the land his father had expanded with greed and blood. He did not mend the fences. He did not count his cattle. He took a heavy iron bar and he went to the south pasture, the one that bordered the Pecos, and he began, post by post, to tear the fence down. Lena watched him. He worked all day, his body straining, his face set in a grim mask of labor. He was not just pulling posts. He was pulling out the roots of his father's sin. When he was finished, a full mile of the ranch lay open to the river. He rode into town. He filed a new document with Commissioner Davies. It was not a sale. It was a trust. He posted a notice on the saloon door. "The McCade Ranch," he had written, "is now a community trust. The south pasture is open range. Any herd moving north or south may graze." He was giving up the very land his father had killed for. He returned to the ranch and began to build something new. By the road that ran past his gate, he dug deep, creating a large, stone-lined water station. He piped water from the river. He built a trough, long and deep. It was for anyone. For settlers. For travelers. For Nolan's people. He was giving back the water. Lena watched all of this. She saw the sweat, the blisters, the exhaustion. She saw a man rebuilding his own soul with his bare hands. That evening, she walked, alone, to the small rise behind the stone house. The two crosses Grant had built stood stark against the purple sky. They were rough, crude, but they were solid. She had avoided this place. It was a monument to her pain. She reached out and put her hand on the raw wood of one. The wood was rough, snagging her skin. She thought of her father. She thought of her mother. She smelled the smoke, that phantom smell that would never leave her. The anger, the cold, hard stone of it, was still there. It would always be there. But it was not all she was. She looked down at the ranch. She saw the new, open pasture. She saw Grant, his shirt soaked in sweat, finishing the trough. Forgiveness, she thought, did not erase the past. It did not make the fire not happen. It did not bring them back, but it was the only thing that allowed a person to move forward, to live. She had been a ghost for 8 years, haunting the living. She was done. She let her hand fall. She took a deep breath, the air cool and sweet, and she walked back down the hill. The town was changing. The Golden Nugget Saloon, once a place of shadow deals, was now the town hall. The piano was quiet. May stood on the bar, not serving drinks, but reading from an Austin newspaper, explaining the new laws, her voice sharp and clear. She was organizing a committee. She was running for mayor. She was, as she had always been, protecting her people. Taza came to the ranch to say goodbye. His shoulder was healed, a new, clean scar. Nayland had asked him to be a bridge. He was to be a messenger, a diplomat, the man who walked between the worlds, carrying news between the Apache camps and the new, healing towns. His time as a lone warrior was over. His time as a guardian, a builder, was beginning. He looked at Lena. "You have your land back," he said. Lena nodded. "And you have your horses." The commissioner had returned them. A state act of peace. He smiled, a rare, warm expression. "We both have our truth." He mounted his pony. "Guard it well." He rode east, not toward the canyon, but toward the open plains. The next morning, Grant and Lena were back in the commissioner's office. Grant had a paper in his hand. It was not a marriage license. It was a legal, binding document. He placed it on the desk in front of Lena. He said, "I paid $20 for you. I bought you. It was the most shameful and the best money I ever spent." He slid the paper toward her. "This is a deed of partnership. It makes you a full, equal, legal owner of the McCade Ranch Trust. All of it." Lena looked at him. She saw the sincerity. She saw the respect. "I am returning the payment," Grant said, his voice thick. "This makes us even." Lena smiled, a small, slow smile. She picked up the pen. "No," she said, "it does not make us even." She signed her name, her signature clear and strong, next to his. "It makes us partners." They walked out into the afternoon light. They were equals. The law had declared it. They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting. The wind was a low sigh in the newly opened fields. It sounded like the prairie was finally breathing out. In the cabin, Lena walked to the small shelf by the door. She took her father's silver watch, the heavy R on its case, from her pocket. She had carried it for 8 years, a hidden weight, a secret anchor of grief. She hung it on a small, empty nail on the porch wall. It clicked against the wood, the silver catching the last of the sunlight. It was not a secret anymore. It was not a burden. It was home. It was where it belonged. Grant came and stood beside her. He did not touch her. He just stood there, sharing the same air, the same silence. It was a comfortable, earned quiet. Lena looked out. Her gaze drifted past the two crosses on the hill, now just familiar shapes in the dusk. Her eyes settled on the thick stand of cottonwood trees, down by the bend in the Pecos. "It is a good spot," she said, her voice soft. Grant looked at her, then at the trees. He knew what she meant. "For what?" "For a ceremony," Lena said, still looking at the river. "A small one." The ceremony was not held in a church. It was held under the wide, generous arms of the cottonwood trees. Down by the bend in the Pecos River, the late afternoon sun was the color of warm honey, filtering through the leaves, dappling the ground. It was not a large gathering, but it was the entire, real town. May was there, her face, for once, not tired but soft. Mrs. Abel was there, her deeds safe, a small, shy smile on her face. The blacksmith, the farrier, the families who had gotten their land back, they were all there. They were not just neighbors. They were a community, forged in the heat of the courtroom. Nalin, the mescalero elder, stood in the place of a preacher. He was not there to speak of a God in the sky. He was there to bear witness, as his people had borne witness to that valley for 1,000 years. Lena wore the blue calico dress, mended and clean. Grant wore a new shirt, his hair combed, his face washed clean of the soot and the past. They stood before Nalin, their hands at their sides. Nalin did not speak of love. He spoke of truth. "You have stood in the fire," he said, his voice quiet. "Yet it carried to every person. You have spoken your truth. You have brought your memories together. Now, you bring your lives together." He held up two simple, thin bands of braided silver, made by a craftsman from his people. Grant took one. He slid it onto Lena's finger. It was cool and solid. Lena took the other. She slid it onto Grant's finger. His hand was rough, the blisters from the fire now healing into new, clean scars. Then, Nalin held up something else. It was not a ring. It was a single, long strip of soft, white deerskin. He did not tie their hands together. He wrapped the deerskin, once around both of their wrists, binding them to each other, a symbol of a shared path. Grant looked at Lena, at the town, at the river. He felt the light, symbolic weight of the deerskin. He turned to the people gathered. He had to say the words. He had to correct the story from the very beginning. "When I first Lena, I paid for her," he said. His voice was steady. "I paid $20. I thought I was buying her freedom." He looked down at Lena. He smiled. "I was wrong. I was just buying my own." He looked back at the crowd. "Today, I do not have a wife. That is not the right word. That is a word of property, of fences. I am here to share my life with my partner." Lena's face was bright. She looked up at him. This man who had confessed his cowardice and then found his courage. This man who had torn down his own fences. She smiled, a slow, real smile that reached her eyes. A smile no one in that town had ever seen. She reached up, put her hand on the side of his face, and she kissed him. It was a slow, certain, public kiss. It was not a brand. It was an agreement. The crowd did not cheer. They did something better. They clapped, a warm, rhythmic, solid sound of approval that rolled through the trees and over the river. May, her eyes shining, clapped the loudest. The ceremony was over. As people came forward to offer congratulations, Taza, who had stood watch at the edge of the clearing, walked into town. He did not go to the jail, which was now empty. Dalton and his men having been taken by state marshals to Austin. He went to the small building that had been the land office, the one with the broken window. It was now being called the Mesquite Ford Town Museum. Taza walked in. The blacksmith was there, cleaning it out. Taza held out his hand. In his palm was the small, brass cartridge, the one Lena had carved. "Return." "This is the first thing for your museum," Taza said. The blacksmith, confused, Took it. What is it? It is a memory, Taza said, so you do not repeat it. He turned and walked out. He mounted his pony and rode east, his new life as a bridge between worlds waiting for him. The sun began to set. The people drifted away, back to their homes, their land secure, their futures their own. Grant and Lena walked, hand in hand, back to the stone house. The wind was cool. The crickets were beginning their night song. The vast, wild prairie was settling into a deep, hopeful peace. The law of men had finally come to the Pecos, but it was a law built on the older, deeper laws of the heart. The next morning, Lena was up before dawn. She saddled her mare. She looked at the small, frayed cloth cord that Grant had untied from her wrist, the one that had fallen to the floor of the shack. She had saved it. She picked it up. She did not tie it back on her arm. She did not need it anymore. Instead, she tied it with a firm, new knot to the leather braid of her horse's reins. It was not a secret. It was not a boundary. It was a reminder, a voluntary, chosen bond. She rode out to the south pasture, the one without fences. She sat on her horse, watching the sun rise, the light flooding the valley, the river a ribbon of silver. She heard a sound, the rumble of wheels, the call of men. A long wagon train was moving up the trail. A dozen wagons, families looking for a new start, their face dusty and tired. The lead wagon, a big Conestoga, pulled up. The driver, a man with a gray beard, looked at the open pasture. He looked at the new, full water trough Grant had built. He looked at Lena. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice tired. "We have been on the trail for a month. Could we rest our stock? Could we take on water?" Lena looked at the wagons. She saw the faces of children peering out. She saw the thirsty, thin cattle. She remembered a barn. She remembered a $5 debt. She nodded at the man. She pointed to the open gate. "This is the McCade Trust," she said, her voice clear and strong. "The water is free. The grass is open. Welcome." She watched as the wagons rolled in, as the families shouted with relief, as the cattle ran to the water. Grant came and stood beside her horse, his hand on its neck. He looked at the wagons. He looked at Lena, silhouetted against the bright, new morning. The words that had started it all, the bitter, angry challenge. "You paid for me, now do it," felt like they had been spoken in another life. The words, the debt, the payment, it was all gone. Lena looked down at him. She saw her partner, her equal. She smiled. "We chose each other," she said, her voice soft. "Now we live it." Grant put his hand on hers, on the reins, his fingers brushing the small, frayed knot. They watched the new day and the new life arrive. The camera of the mind pulls back. It pulls back from the two of them, from the ranch house, from the wagons, from the new, full water trough. It pulls back, high above the brown, winding Pecos River, over the healing town, over the red dust of the high plateau, until the trail itself is just a thin, hopeful line, heading west into a future that was still being written. Thank you for listening to this story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.